Good morning. So glad that you are with us in worship this morning. And I hope that if you're not with us right now, if there's reasons preventing you from worshiping now, that you will later in this day. This is, of course, the Lord's Day. And this is that occasion that we gather and worship. I had let Alan know what the lesson was. And I said, I don't know of any songs that are related to this lesson. But then when I got back his list of songs, and he had chosen Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, I couldn't help but think he has chosen one of the best songs before this particular lesson. We're going to be looking at COVID-19 and the Christian. Now I realize someone might say, I've heard so much about COVID-19, I don't want to hear about it on Sunday. Well, I can understand that. But I do think that it's good that we consider COVID-19 and the Christian. That is me, you, trying to live faithful in Christ Jesus, and how this particular thing might affect our lives. Now, we have seen picture after picture from the United States and even around the world that have made us realize it is something serious to be dealt with. For in my lifetime in the United States, I do not recall a field hospital set up anywhere. And yet in Central Park, a field hospital was set up. And some hospitals have been overwhelmed with the COVID-19 cases. Every day you can hear about how many cases in Alabama, how many cases in the United States, and then accompanying with that, of course, is then how many deaths in Alabama and how many deaths in the United States. These particular figures were from last night. I'm not sure how they are as far as other figures you might see, but I think they'd have to be close. But as you consider COVID-19, we've seen horrors when it hit the nursing homes. And then we've also realized it's deadly. Data shows that 1 in 10 hospitalized middle-aged COVID patients in the U.S. don't survive. Well, of course, we realize many are not hospitalized. We're thankful for that. But COVID-19 is not the first. We've had other kinds of disasters that have hit the United States. Just a few years ago, 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. And there was devastation with a storm surge and with the winds across South Mississippi. But then we watched for days as then the floods came into New Orleans, as people were literally stranded, some on roofs. And of course, you might recall seeing those around the Superdome who were struggling to find high ground. Some lost their homes. Many lost their homes to these floods. But if we go back before that, you recall the 9/11 attack and how that plane hit the first tower, that plane hit the second tower, and then under the heat, the melting iron just collapsed, and both of those buildings came down. But if you were to look at the world itself, I recall with amazement what the tsunami devastated in 2004 in the Indian Ocean and etc. In fact, about 225,000 plus people were killed as a result of this tsunami. Looking at the pictures, to me it almost seems like science fiction, but it was real and it was horrible. One of the worst that I've read about, no, I was not alive in 1918, but one of the worst I've read about is the flu epidemic of 1918. At that particular time, and it was worldwide, there were 675,000 deaths recorded in the United States, 50 million deaths worldwide, and many estimates go as high as 100 million deaths worldwide. I think it's because of what the Spanish flu has done that's 1918. But fast forwarding to 2019 and 2020, it's why this COVID-19 is being taken so seriously, and it ought to be. We don't want to reach the point like in 1918 and 1919 that there were mass graves for those dying of that Spanish flu. So what are some things to consider about COVID-19 and the Christian, and to realize this has to do with any kind of trouble, devastation, trouble that we might face? There's three things we're going to notice this morning. First is why. Why this COVID-19? And then second, we're going to look at problems with social isolation. And then third, finding hope and peace. First of all, we're asking the question, why? Why this COVID-19? Now, some have said, well, it's God's judgment on America. It's God's judgment on the world. Now, it is the case that when you go back to your Old Testament readings, and you can go to the prophets, and you certainly can find there were occasions where God brought judgment upon people and nations. And there was suffering and there was devastation. But friends, I want to read to you something. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. On this why, look at Judges 6:13. Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us?" And no doubt many are asking today, why then has all this happened to us? Dr. Kirk Brothers is president of Heritage University, and he wrote kind of a short snippet, and I want to read that to you because it does well with answering those who would insist that COVID-19 is God bringing judgment on mankind. Reading this, it says, "Please stop saying that God caused or is using COVID-19 to wake us up. Unless God spoke to someone in a burning bush this morning, we have no idea why this happened outside the biological, social, and political causes. Did God allow it? Yes. He is sovereign Lord of all. Can we learn from this? Yes. But that is a far cry from saying or implying that God destroyed countless businesses and families, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and left a wake of devastation that will last far into the future, just so my family can learn to slow down and play Monopoly together. Be silent where God is silent. Do not try to be a divine mind reader or put words in God's mouth. We risk blasphemy, and we can turn people who have been hurt by this away from God. We have no evidence that God directly caused this, and He has not told us why He allowed it. All we know is that He can help us through it, and He wants us to be the presence of His Son as we do so. These words, I think, are good common sense when someone wants to insist that God has caused this or brought this about as punishment. But we're still asked, well, why? We often do not have an answer for why. And anything is mere speculation, and often speculation does more harm than good. But I'm going to consider these ideas as to the why. And if you would notice, we're not being very definite with regards to these things. But these are why some things do happen in our world. One is that God allows it. but that the affliction was at the hand of Satan. You go back and read the book of Job. This was certainly the case for Job's troubles. God allowed it. But if we say who caused it, it was Satan himself that caused it. No, God was not to be blamed. It was Satan's fault in the case of Job. Secondly, consider time and chance. And you read of this very thing in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. There you read, "Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift." That is, sometimes the fastest don't win the race. Then he says, "Nor the battle to the strong." You'd think the strongest army would win the battle, but no, not always. "Nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge." We just have to say this. Sometimes things don't happen the way we think it would. But then he says, but time and chance happen to them all. Some things are just not explainable. Continuing, "For man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them." So time and chance, sometimes, in other words, it happens. No real explanation. And then next, notice on the why, that sun and rain fall on both the evil and the just. This we read in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45. Jesus had said, "So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." That is, the sun, the rain, it happens, and it happens on the good and the bad. You might say the COVID-19, the sun, the rain. Yes, it happens on the evil and the good, the just and the unjust. And then notice as well, God set this world to work in natural order and fashion. You find this in Genesis 1:11, and God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruits, fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth," and it was so. In other words, here you have this tree. It produces the fruit, or ultimately a seed, which finds its way into the ground, and then you know what happens? It germinates, and there comes another tree. And so this is the natural order. Well, now there would be a natural order too, wouldn't there be? The viruses, bacteria, fungi. Now those we might not like so much. And yes, some of those might even be beneficial in some way, but many could be deadly. But I think they would still fall within this natural order and fashion as God's created. Sometimes things happen because of man's free will. Don't blame what we do to ourselves on God. Now, this is a gross picture, okay? And I know you're not going to do it. You better not do it. Lick a doorknob. But if somebody licks a doorknob and then gets sick, who do they have to blame? Only themselves. And there's many things that happen in this world that men are the cause of. They hurt themselves, or they're the cause of, and they hurt somebody else. And so here are several reasons why things just happen. Now, as far as which of these would apply to COVID-19, might be hard to say. But I would take a step back and say, I don't read of COVID-19 in Matthew through Revelation. I don't read the why or the cause of COVID-19 in Matthew through Revelation. And so therefore, we need to be careful about any speculation. That's the why. Now, number two, let's consider problems from social isolation. It is the case that with COVID-19, one of the ways countries in the world have dealt with it is social isolation or social distancing. Now, I'll admit, I don't like that phrase, social distancing. I'd rather it be physical distancing. Maybe you've seen this picture. I guess this was this man's way of being sure nobody's going to get close to me. And it is the case that we have had drilled in our heads over the last month to 2 months, keeping a distance. But yet it is the case. This is one of the most effective means of slowing down the disease or preventing the disease or keeping our own selves from getting this disease. We understand that. And we're practicing that, and so much so that basically the entire economy almost has come to a skidding halt as people are not allowed to go to work and so many businesses shut down just to keep people away from people. But with this social isolation, problems have arisen. Now, one of these problems, of course, is very obvious. Loneliness. Some people are isolated with their family, and there's several in the family maybe, and there's not so much loneliness. But some, they're by themselves. Let me say this. Physical distancing does not have to be social distancing. I really don't care for the term. You've heard me say that, but I don't really care for the term social distancing. We still need each other. We still need to be social, but maybe we need to keep physical distance. We are so blessed in this day and age. We've got telephones. And no, I'm not suggesting any monkeys are making the phone calls, but I do think how blessed we are that we can still stay in touch, even if we are not physically close together. Maybe it's the phone where we're talking. Maybe it's a cell phone where we're texting. Or maybe it's you both have an iPhone and you're FaceTiming. Or you both have an Android and you're doing the whatever Android calls it. Or maybe that you get on the computer and now there's this thing called Zoom. I never heard about Zoom till 3 weeks ago, and now I hear about it everywhere. And in fact, last Tuesday night was the first time I got on Zoom with some of my Easter Methodist friends that I have not seen in a month or more. And I was so glad to see them, and they put their children even on there. We need each other, and we still need each other. We need to be sure that loneliness does not overtake. Take your phone and, as it were, reach out and touch somebody, symbolically, of course, with your telephone. Don't allow this social distancing, physical distancing, to be overwhelming loneliness. A second problem is depression. Depression, sometimes it's the result of the fear of the disease, and sometimes it's kind of an overwhelming fear. I talked with someone back just last week, and they spoke of a family member who deals with problems with depression and anxiety. And she spoke of how that this disease and the constant news about this disease were just weighing down this loved one. Depression, fear of the disease. Some of it's this way too. We're hearing so much about social isolation, social distancing, physical distancing, that we see somebody coming, it's like, oh, you got the disease. And we fear people. We're afraid if they get very close to us, Yes, physical distancing is that best way. But I have to fear the person. Maybe it's, going to the store, seeing empty shelves. Many have lost their jobs. That's not easy. That can cause depression. And some have had financial backsets as a result of loss of job or otherwise. All of these things and others that have been experienced during this COVID-19 time can cause depression. Yeah, one of the problems from social isolation. If we were to say how to overcome depression, well, in the very last part of this lesson, I do think that much of those things would help us overcome depression. Now, I'm not so much speaking here of just clinical depression, the mental illness that has overtaken so many, but more the situational depression, as a result of COVID-19. Suicide. Now, back when this was getting started, I was reading, some people were saying, this shutting down the economy and this physical distancing, social distancing, it was going to be causing suicide, and they were going to even be blaming the governors for suicides. Well, then I read a headline, an article. COVID-19 is likely to lead an increase in suicides. That's just one more problem from this social isolation that could take place. Pornography. Somebody might say, what? What's that got to do with this? Adam Fawn wrote an article about COVID-19 and porn. And he cited a statistic that some porn sites have had an uptick in people viewing the porn there at those websites. And somebody might say, how and why? Maybe some that are socially isolated alone, too much time by themselves, and have succumbed to this temptation. And I've read this, and this goes back to when all this was getting started. Spouse abuse in these times of social isolation. And this is so sad, but it's a reality that many countries have had to address. In fact, the United Nations called on Sunday for urgent action to combat the worldwide, look at this, worldwide surge in domestic violence. I urge all government to put women's safety first as they respond to the pandemic. Sad, disturbing, but a reality. The uptick in spousal abuse from this social isolation. In China, one lady said her husband had abused her throughout their 6-year relationship, but that the COVID-19 outbreak made things far worse. In Spain, the emergency number for domestic violence received 18% more calls in the first 2 weeks of lockdown than in the same period a month earlier. The French police, moving to France, the French police reported a nationwide spike of about 30% in domestic violence. And one particular article noted special arrangements had been made for spouse victims' rescue in Italy, Spain, Britain, in the unique days of social distancing. And what that amounted to is those countries, like most cities in America, may have a safe place where victims of domestic violence can go. But some of those safe places put them close to each other. And in the days of trying to keep that physical social distance, being closer to others is not the good thing. In fact, what I read in this article, that some countries were renting hotels. So each victim of spousal abuse could have their own room, keeping separate, social distance from others. I hope you're disturbed at reading these things. I am, very much so. Spousal abuse never, ever has a proper place. There is never a time that a man or woman should lift a fist against their husband, their wife. Never a time. And for a person who is trying to live a Christian life, it really ought to be that this is the last thing that could ever happen. But we know that it has happened. It does happen. Sometimes it gets started with just verbal abuse. That's kind of mental, emotional abuse. I would encourage every man, every woman, sometime to just take a step back and say, what I just said, how did it sound? Take a step back and replay it in their own minds, as if to say, if my wife or my husband said that to me in that manner, how would I have received it? And you know, it's probably the case that many husbands and wives, they know, if you would, what pushes the button of their spouse. Don't push the button. Let us not be guilty of spousal abuse. And I would suggest this: if a spouse has suffered it, get help. If a spouse has rendered it and given it, get help that you don't ever do this again. How horrible. But all of these things we've noticed, this social isolation, people keeping separate, has brought on more problems and difficulties maybe than we would have thought would have happened. So then, in the midst of all this, how do we find hope and peace? How do we find hope and peace? Number one, I would beg of you, encourage you, you set your mind on things above. In Colossians 3, verses 1 and 2, if then you have been raised with Christ. This is kind of like a now that I'm a Christian passage. If you've been raised with Christ, you've been baptized, raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. You think about it. There's no COVID-19 in heaven. He says, you set your mind on things that are above, not on things of the earth. If you let yourself just completely focus on this COVID-19, and I want to tell you, you turn on the TV and listen to the news, that's one of the first things they are going to lead with, and that may be the only thing they talk about. Sometimes I've wondered, what news is in the world if this particular news wasn't there? Well, if COVID-19 wasn't there, what news would they be reporting? I don't know. All we hear about is COVID-19. And you may be thinking, now he's preaching on it. Well, you let your mind, you be centered on things that are above, not just on things on the earth. Secondly, and it's kind of akin to this, but think eternal, not temporary. In 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18, so we do not lose heart. This is the idea. We don't become discouraged. It's as though our outer man or outer self is wasting away. Our inner self is being renewed day by day for this light, momentary affliction. Okay, now, If you would go back in Paul's day and realize he's speaking of the suffering of which they were enduring, some of it wasn't so easy. Some of it wasn't just for a moment. But in contrast to what is heavenly, it was light and momentary. What is being troubled in our lives by this COVID-19? Light. As compared to heaven, momentary. Well, you know, I made mention of several disasters as we began this, just by way of introduction. All those are past us completely. They may endure for a time, but they're going to be over. COVID-19 may endure for a time, but it'll be over. He says, for this light, momentary affliction. Now, I know Paul is not talking about COVID-19, but I think it has its applications. He says it's preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are, look at this, transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Once again, we had said previous, looking to things above, not to things on the earth. Well, now he's saying, you look to that which is eternal, not just to that which is temporary. And of course, the things that are eternal are heavenly, the things that are temporary on earth. So it's kind of like, where do you let your mind dwell? On the earthly, that's temporal? Or you let your mind dwell on the heavenly, that's eternal? So think heavenly, think eternal. And this is the perspective, temporary versus eternal. And then lastly, you trust God. Hebrews 13 verses 5 and 6. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For as he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. See that promise? I'll never leave you nor forsake you. So that we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what can man do to me. If we were going to summarize these two verses, it would be, trust God. Trust God. So that we may confidently say, the Lord is my helper. And then lastly, know the shepherd. And we're not going to read the entirety of Psalm 23. I'm going to start in verse 1 and just go to verse 4. But there he said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Yes, know the shepherd. Psalm 23 means nothing if the one writing it does not know the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. And as he speaks of the green pastures and the still waters and how his soul is restored, it's even in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death and evil. But how is it that all of these things happen? He says, because you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And so here are some things that I would suggest that are to be considered with COVID-19 and the Christian. The why and problems in the midst of social isolation, and then how we can, as it were, overcome the difficulties, troubles, as we let our minds be on things above, things that are eternal, as we trust God, as we have God as our shepherd.